Hello, everyone. Welcome in. We are super excited about tonight's talk. This series has been incredible so far. And I am so excited for all that we're going to get into tonight. Before we get started, just to introduce myself for those who are new to our page, to this platform, to this series. My name is Lauren White. I serve as the online pastor for the Life Church. And we are in the middle of an amazing virtual Black History series where we're discussing a plethora of different topics across Black culture, Black influence, the Black church, and our faith, and how all of these things tie together. So far, we've been able to cover mental health and wellness. We've talked about how to preserve Black stories for our children and Black history. And tonight, we are going to talk about the impact of Black music on our culture. So before we get into tonight's conversation and introduce our wonderful guest, I want you to share this conversation. If you could just click that share button. If you're on Facebook specifically, if you're on YouTube, you can tag someone or share the link. But share, I believe that this is a conversation that you won't want to miss. I'm really excited about it. We have our very own Pastor Rivers Taylor, who is joining us. Not only is he one of the pastors at the Life Church, he is also one of my closest friends. I'm really excited that we get to have this conversation here on this particular platform. He is a founding member of Zóé Worship, the recording group out of the Life Church. He is a father, he is a husband, he is a friend, and I'm really excited about just kind of hearing his perspective on how Black music has shaped our culture, how it's shaped the way that we express the gospel, how it's gotten us through things. There's so many things that we're going to cover. So without further ado, I would love to bring to our stream none other than Pastor Rivers Taylor.
Hey, what's going on?
Hello.
Hey, Pastor Lauren.
Hi, Pastor Rivers. How are
That
you?
was such a powerful introduction. I hope that I live up to your expectations.
So much.
How you doing?
I'm
You feeling good?
I feel good. I am really excited about this conversation. I feel like this series so far has been incredibly impactful.
Yeah,
And we
absolutely.
want to hear from some very interesting, very well-versed people on a plethora of different topics. I'm excited about us getting a chance to talk to you because a lot of people know you as one of the founding members of Zóé Worship. People have seen you previously as a worship pastor. Others might have seen you as a musician. I know that you are also a resident worship leader for several churches, a couple of
A
churches.
couple of churches.
You're famous. You're famous.
No, not at all.
But a lot of people may not know just like where your background in music started because even your range, a lot of people are used to seeing you in a worship space, but you got a lot of range as it relates to musical history and experience. I want to know, what was your first introduction to music as a kid?
Okay. First, let me start here. I'm a little intimidated coming off of the talks that have been leading up to our talk tonight. I mean, week one, you had the battles, uh, and they're just incredible minds. And then you had Dr. Nia Hamlet, and she, I mean, come on, we all know that she's just a bona fide genius. And then you have me. I feel like I should have just went first and just got like the low lying fruit out of the way, and then made way for the giants. But let me just say I'm grateful to be here, and thank you for asking me to be a part of this series.
Absolutely.
As far as my start in music, I think my start in music was pretty simple. Of course, growing up in church and being a pastor's kid, when you're a pastor's kid, you kind of do everything. So, like, I was an usher. I worked in kids ministry. Well, it wasn't really kids ministry; it was Sunday school.
Yes.
And a part of my responsibility was playing the drums. So I grew up playing the drums in my parents' church. I was not good. I don't want y'all to get confused. Like, oh man, I was blazing on drums. I was very basic on drums, but I played those growing up. But I remember that being my introduction to gospel music. And then my dad, like I said, who was the pastor and still pastors to this day. Both of my parents still pastors to this day. On the car ride to church and the car ride home from church, he will be introducing me to different types of music. So of course we would get to church and we would sing hymns. Like we were pretty traditional. So we sang out the red hymn book, not the green one, but the red one. We were singing At the Cross, and we were saying lift him up, still he speaks from eternity. We sang that. But on the way to church, he was introducing me to Marvin Gaye and the Shy Lights and James Brown and Curtis Mayfield. And then on the way home, he was letting me listen to other things like Kenny Rogers, who's a country singer, and introducing me to all these different sorts and kinds and genres of music that I know we're going to talk about a little bit later. But that was kind of my shaping in the beginning of me. Before I even started playing music, I was around music. Before I even considered myself a musician, before I even considered myself an artist, that was like my runway into what music was. Between church, where I kind of understood the gospel centric understanding of music, but then also those car rides with my dad, man, I'll remember those for the rest of my life.
I absolutely love that. So we'll take this next question in two parts because you talk about your introduction to gospel music, but then you also talk about your introduction to kind of music as a whole. And you name some very key staples in Black music and Black culture in particular. And so I want to touch on those. But first, I want to know, how did growing up in the Black church, so you're a young musician, maybe by force at this time, but it eventually turned into kind of who you are today. How did growing up in the Black church shape you as a singer, a musician, and an artist?
I think two primary things. I think I could go with like the low-lying fruit of like the emotion behind it, that the emotion that you feel. But if I could just kind of pull that back, I think the reason why those moments were so emotional and pulled on your heart and pulled on your spirit was because it was so communal in nature. Going to our church, and I grew up in a small church where everybody knew everybody was family, and that communal part played such a major role in how we worshiped, how we praised, how we expressed worship, how we communicated with each other through song and through lyric and through dance and through mime and through all these different forms of expression, forms of art. That communal piece was so deeply embedded in me. So even now, if I'm leading worship, if I'm singing in another kind of context, or if I'm singing another genre, it's still that, hey, everybody in the room, we're all on the same page, we're all on the same level, we're all communicating the same thing. I think also another thing that I learned right there, just to be honest with you, is just improvisation and just feeling the moment. Once again, going back to that communal piece, feeling the moment, understanding what's happening in the room, and meeting, sounds weird to say, but almost meeting the needs of the people. Music has such a way of touching the mind and the heart that almost sometimes spoken words can't do. I think that's almost like the underlying thread between all of us. So part of that improvisation, I think, is being able to pivot and saying, hey, there's a need here. There's an emotional kind of pool here. Let's all get on the same page. And if this person's hurting and if that person's in need, let's all rush together in song, in worship, or in song, or in lyric, or in melody, and be able to uphold each other. And I think that's always the outcome. Like you leave feeling better, right?
Yeah.
Feeling some type of way, like you feel inspired, or you feel happy, or you feel jovial when you leave those kind of communal moments, and being able to pivot on a dime. And those are two of the main things I think I learned, like growing up and singing gospel and singing extemporaneously, just those moments that are really birthed in community.
Hmm.
I draw a thread back to everything. Those communal moments really influenced me. Now I'm looking for communal moments, no matter what context I'm in, Black, white, Hispanic, it doesn't matter. Like, I think those communal moments are always what I'm looking for. And if it's not there, I'm looking to build it.
I love that. I love that. When you talk about uh, you looking to kind of build those moments, I think a lot of people, again, don't know about kind of the depth of your history as it relates to music. So you've got Rivers as a kid playing drums in his dad's church.
Yeah.
But then you kind of grew up and have been able to do a lot of different things. Can you kind of give us a look into kind of what your musical journey has been since then?
Sure. Sure. So like I said, my parents were pastors, grew up in church. So for a while I was singing only in church. But I like to say that because my parents were pastors, I saw the good, bad, and the ugly of church work and just church ministry, for better or for worse. And with me being exposed to that at a relatively young age, I started to have reservations, if you will, about ministry and about church. Never about my faith, but more so about the avenue by which my faith was being expressed. So when I got to college, and I didn't go to college far away. I'm from Hampton, Newport News. I went to Old Dominion for undergrad, so I just went right across the water. That's where you and I met, Lauren. I very much so was involved in music, but not in the traditional religious context. All that to say, let me say it another way. When I went to college, I started doing R&B. I started doing rock and roll. I started doing a number of things that helped me express music in a different way. And not to mention, being a young college student, I needed to make a few extra dollars.
Mhm.
So that was a way to really kind of help, for lack of a better word, grease my pockets a little bit. But that also gave me a number of years of experience and being able to build community in a different types of way. So I met a number of my,
Well,
say it
right?
again, say it
I
again.
said, and you classical training as well, right?
Yes, absolutely. So my started off my undergrad degree in music education, studying classical music, and then halfway through, I changed my focus to jazz studies, and I graduated with a jazz studies degree. But it's because of those forums, those extensions of music that weren't just gospel. I still have many of the friends that I still have to this day, my lifelong friends. We made music together, put our projects together. Um, and we were able to express ourselves in a lot of different ways that maybe we didn't necessarily grow up doing. Really be able to experiment with different sorts of expressions through music, still trying to accomplish a somewhat of the same goal of just touching hearts and touching people and bringing everybody together, but just in a different kind of way.
I love that. So you talk about that community impact, right? And
Yeah.
how it kind of spans the genres within Black music. When we think about gospel music, and we think about jazz, we think about R&B. All of these things are things that help bind people together, help them feel something, hopefully uplift them in some sort of way. How would you describe the impact of Black music on American culture in particular?
How would I describe Black music on the impact of American culture? I think, and I want to make sure I'm careful when I say this. I think that in the fab in the fabric of American culture, and not even just in music. I want to go broad, and then we can go music. I think in the fabric of American culture, you will always find the influence of Black culture. You will
Mhm.
always find the influence or the fingerprint or even the handprint of the African American society. I think it's inescapable. I think no matter what form you go into, I don't care whether it's business, I don't care whether it's fashion, I don't care if it's art, I don't care if it's music, I don't care if it's technology or technological advances. I think somewhere etched into the fabric of American culture in every facet, you will find the handprint of a Black woman, of a Black man, of a Black community, that help push that um, initiative along. I think when it comes to Black music, it's no different. I think when you think about the different extensions of music, you think about rock, and you think about jazz, and you think about blues, and you think about hip hop, and you think about all these different things, it's undoubtedly influenced, if not started by the Black community.
Mhm.
Um, Really very much so birthed out of things like call and response, or things like these heart-wrenching melodies that you hear even in our present day music. You can
Yeah.
still very much so, if you do the diligent work, still go back and find threads to slave era, to Jim Crow era, to Reconstruction era, and different things like that. If you do the hard work, if you're not careful and you look at just the surface level of things, you'll begin to placate and think that these are just common things that were made by other cultures or other races or other ethnicities. But if you really look back and start to uncover and peel back the years and years of development of that genre, a development of that lane of art, you'll undoubtedly find along the way at some point that there was a Black musician of some sort, or a Black inventor of some sort, or a Black artist of some sort that helped either to create the foundation for that art or that foundation for that music, or
Yeah.
somehow helped to push that music along. So all that to say, I know I kind of went around the mulberry bush.
Good.
But I want to be clear. I think all throughout American culture, no matter what it is, but I know we're specifically talking about music, you will find the handprint of the Black.
That's really, really good. Look, guys, as you are listening, if you have any questions that pop up, any thoughts or any questions, we want you to leave them in the comments. We're going to take a few minutes at the end of this conversation to answer any questions. And if this conversation has inspired you so far in any way, definitely share it. Share it with a friend. Maybe share it with someone who's been interested in the impact of Black music on culture. It hasn't really know where to start. Share it with someone who's just a fan of Zóé Worship and loves Pastor Rivers and wants to learn more about his perspective. Really, really excited about the things that you have shared so far. So now you're in a space where you are definitely influencing many different cultures, many different spaces. When I think about Zoe, I think about the fact that we have seen many different congregations, many different audiences singing the words to songs that you wrote, right? Which is amazing. We had that experience even this past weekend in South Carolina, where someone was singing Psalms 23, our worship team was singing Psalms 23, and there's a crowd full of people not from Virginia, never been to TLC, but they're singing the words to Psalms 23, which is absolutely incredible. And you kind of touched on this a little bit, but do you see a thread or any type of thread between the origin of Black gospel music and the types of things that you create today, or the type of music or message that Zoe shares today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think to your point, I think even the heart of Zoe, I think, is to share a message that we can all rally around. I think let's use your example just for this moment, just for as a tangible thing that we can talk about. There is a community in South Carolina that I've never met, that practically you had never met before that weekend,
Mhm.
that honestly I may never cross paths with,
Yeah,
that we may never meet face to face, but somehow there's a unifying message there, that's building and girding our hearts, no matter where we are. And I think that's always been the heart of Black music. Even when you think about like when the origins of Black music and how we use music to communicate with each other from afar off. You know what I'm
mhm.
saying? We weren't using these songs to communicate one to another right next to each other, but we were yelling out across fields. We were yelling out through the woods to kind of direct and guide each other, or just to communicate with each other, to let each other know that we were still there. I think the
Yeah,
same thread is birthed today with even some of our music with Zoe. Just, hey, the message is still traveling, and the message is to unify all of us. The message is to share the gospel, which I think we're going to talk about in a minute, just the story of Jesus, the good news of Jesus Christ.
mhm.
And not only who he was, but who he is and who he can be for us, and how we can stand true in that. And that's the unifying message. That's the narrative that I think
Yeah.
that we're all trying and really advocating to share. And I think that's just an example of how even the origins of Black music still influence our art today.
That's really, really good. That's really, really good. And you touched on this, and I think this is something that's been so central. Like when we think about Black music, we either see in slavery times, are people singing scripture, right? Are
Yeah.
stringing scripture along as a path to freedom. We see
Yeah.
the gospel being a hope, a source of hope to get out of a very desperate situation.
Yeah.
We see that same thing carry us through generations as it relates to getting through Jim Crow era. And when we think of a lot of the social movements that really shaped the freedoms that we experience now, and some that we're still very much so fighting for, right? You see this consistent
Very
thread.
much.
And you also see where the gospel has been an act of resistance, right?
Yes. Yes.
Um, and a lot of people tend to say that the gospel was not for Black people. And I know we'll talk about that even more in next week's conversation when we start talking about Black faith and theology. But where a lot of people now say that Black faith, or the gospel rather, was not designed for Black people, when in fact we use the gospel as a form of resistance to show and share that Jesus was actually for us, that hope and freedom was actually for us, and very much the way that God would save oppressed peoples through the Bible, that we believe that that same God was ours and for us.
Absolutely.
So what responsibility do we have? And I'm thinking about any gospel artists that might listen to this, right?
Yeah.
Or I think about anyone who may find themselves singing songs pinned or steeped in Black gospel. What responsibility do we have to preserve the gospel in our music?
I think what responsibility do we have to okay. I'm gonna try to keep this brief because I feel
You can take your
so
time. You got a few minutes.
okay. I feel so strongly, and I wanna start, if I can be candid, if you will allow me, with just a critique of maybe modern day gospel music. And please don't nobody come in my DMs and be like, Pastor Rivers don't believe in gospel music. I undoubtedly do. I think there could be times where, with good intentions, um,
Mhm.
we could manipulate and mutate almost the scriptures and the gospel to almost not even be gospel centered anymore.
Mm,
Things become very um, prosperity based. Things become very, very um, they become things that don't necessarily point us to who God is or who Jesus is, and it points directly to what God and Jesus can do for us.
yeah.
Aside from what the gospel truly tells. The gospel, for those of us who don't know, maybe you just come in, and I never want to just assume that people know what the gospel is. The gospel is
Right.
the good news of Jesus Christ.
Yes.
Jesus Christ came down, became flesh, and dwelled among us, the Bible says.
Mhm.
Came, lived among us, ministered to the people. He healed the sick, he raised the dead, he cast out devils, he taught the people, he went and was crucified as an innocent man. He
Yeah.
died for our sins, rose on the third day and ascended into heaven. That's the
Yeah.
gospel. Okay,
Yes.
stop there. I
Mhm.
think there are times where we take the gospel message and the gift of salvation and turn it into a number of other gifts that may still be true biblically, but are not the central focus of the gospel.
Mm.
You know what I'm saying? So I
Yep.
think I want to draw it back here. I think the responsibility of us as gospel artists is to hold true to the pure gospel narrative.
That's so
I'm not
good.
saying I'm not saying that God doesn't want us prosperous. I'm not saying that God doesn't want us flourishing. I think that's all throughout the scriptures. Those are biblical principles that we can talk about another week. I know you're going to talk about that next week with faith and theology, so I don't want to overstep
Yep.
my line. I think that undoubtedly God wants these things for us, but when it
Mhm.
comes to the sharing of the pure gospel narrative, I want to make sure, I think that we as gospel artists, or we just as Christian artists in general, like I don't want to isolate just gospel artists, but we as Christian artists in general have the responsibility, we have the mandate to keep the gospel message pure. And I
Yes.
think sometimes sometimes in our desire, or even with, like I said, with good intention to reach more people with the Christian message, we sometimes dilute the gospel for the sake of expansion, or for the sake of uh, 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 for lack of a better words, I'll just name it commercialism, and for
Yeah.
the sake of tangible success.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying, once again, I'm not saying those things are wrong. I'm not saying that tangible success should be avoided. However, I think that we still have a mandate. I think tangible success should be avoided when it dilutes your mandate.
That's very good. Could you say that one more time?
Yeah, like tangible success should be avoided if it dilutes your mandate.
That's
Like,
good.
if you have a mandate, you have a responsibility to do a certain thing. You should never, I think, give or dilute what it is that you're called to do just for the sake of tangible gain or tangible success.
That's
What
very
profits a man to gain the whole world and still lose his soul? Like, that's. I'm sorry, I don't want to get too deep in this, but
hot.
but like, what profits a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? Um, Part of your soul is like living out the purpose that God has put in you, and
Mhm.
part of every believer's purpose on the earth is to share the gospel and to evangelize and make disciples.
Yeah.
Um, and part of that making disciples is sharing the true gospel message. And as gospel artists, that is part of us. That's part of us being fishers of men. What Jesus says, like being fishers of men and telling the story of Jesus Christ. So all that to say, I think our responsibility is to keep the gospel message pure, because the world needs it.
Mhm.
It's necessary. It can't be avoided. We are called to preach and teach and sing the gospel to the nations. Um,
Yeah.
and I never want us to lose sight of that responsibility, for the sake of likability, for the sake of shares, for the sake of commercialism, for the sake of just success. Not that those things are bad. I want to be clear, but not at the expense of the gospel. So
Yeah, that's so, so good. Now, not to say that anyone cannot sing the gospel, right?
yeah,
Anyone can sing the gospel, right?
everybody. Mhm.
Yes, everybody can. It's a message for everyone.
Yes,
Think at the same time, it's really interesting to look at the significant impact that
yes,
Black people have had in the sharing of the gospel message through music,
mm,
and you could say it really was birthed in Black people, in Black culture. It's
yes,
amazing to see how generations of oppressed people, or got to generations of oppression and birthed the gospel message in this way,
yes.
of that, right? And then we get to 2022, and we see the artists that we have today. How does it feel? Now, you are a singer, a songwriter. Again, you write gospel songs that people are
Mhm.
singing literally all over the country. How does it feel for you personally to be a part of that historical thread?
I think is I think it's two things. I think it's um, just very awe-striking, number one, because like you said, there's so many generations that have come before me and have become for all of us that really just did the hard work of laying the foundation, um, of just sharing the gospel in the way that we express it, and the ridicule that undoubtedly came with that, and the criticism that undoubtedly came with that. And if it was not for their tenacity, if it wasn't for their resilience, there wouldn't be a Zóé. There wouldn't be a number of the gospel artists that we see on the mainstream media today. I think with that, though, going back to even our previous point, I feel such a weight of a responsibility to do this correctly, or to do this right.
Yeah.
And not a way in a negative way. No, not. I don't feel burdened by it, like as in
Mhm.
it's wearying. Not at all. I think I feel such a strong responsibility to carry this narrative with integrity, and carry the truth um, unequivocally, and
Mhm.
without manipulating it and without diluting it. because the same message has been carried throughout generations. And clearly there's nothing wrong with the message, and there's nothing you have to do to manipulate the message. But I
Yeah.
feel I hate to use the word mandate again, but I feel such a mandate to keep that pure with everything that I can. And that's not
Yeah.
to say that I'm always going to be doing it perfectly. I think that as generations go with anything, not just with music, just with anything, I think certain principles sometimes get lost in translation. I think
Mhm.
certain practices get lost in translation. And we try our best to hold on to what we know, even if we weren't there to experience it. I think that's why, just kind of taking a little bit of a rabbit trail, I think that's why storytelling is so important. I think
Yes.
that's why sharing conversations with each other, specifically with people that are not of your family, but kind of still in your community, are so important. I think that's why sharing with elders are so important, because they have insight that was given to them that can then be given to you. And then I think about my little ones. I have three little ones, 10, 5, and 3, and about the insight I'm going to give them.
Yeah.
Um, but that's what storytelling is so important. And though, like I said, some things, I'm not saying everything is going to be documented appropriately. Not everything is going to be translated effectively, but the things that we can translate and things that we can hold on to, it's our responsibility, or I feel like it's my responsibility to
Mhm.
make sure we're holding on to those, and we're honoring those, and we're revering those, not idolizing them, but very much so holding on to them as truths that help us navigate into the future. I think you said something, Pastor Lauren. I just want to just briefly touch on some of the things that we have experienced in the past. Just our ancestors and the generations that come before us, we're very much so experiencing today. Maybe not on the same scale, maybe not with the same ferocious nature, but definitely underlying issues, subliminal issues, subtle issues that were experienced by our parents and our grandparents undoubtedly are starting to resurface now in a more public way. I think we can undoubtedly look at the people that have come before us and say, hey, not everything was done perfectly, but there are certain things that we can still translate to our generations now in 2022. Um, and that's also to do with music, and also to do, I think about how not even just gospel artists, but artists in general use their platform to speak truth to power,
Yeah.
speak truth to what was going on, and that strength and that accuracy and that precision with their words and with their art is something that we can still replicate today. It's
Mhm.
not something that should be casted to the side. It's not something that should be lost. It's not something that should just be written to the history books, but we should be writing that into the fabric of our lives currently, just with our art and our music and just our minds and the way that we communicate with each other and are able to share just our heart. I think those are things, those are tools, those are practices that we can still hold on to current day. So all that to say, I feel like every time you ask me a question, I go
No,
boom.
this has been great. This has been
But I think all that to say, as someone who's a part of the thread, I look at all those things, and I feel just such a strong responsibility to keep those things alive. Certain things, I'm not saying, like I said, not everything was perfect,
Mhm.
but certain practices I know that help sustain the generations that come before us.
Yeah.
Undoubtedly, they're gonna help sustain us in the future.
That's really, really good. That's really, really good. So, for anyone listening, whether they're an artist or whether there's someone who's just really intrigued and inspired, and maybe even wants to look at how they can look back at history to make sure that they're not only preserving the gospel message, but really kind of getting in touch with the way in which they're supposed to express and tell it.
Right.
Um, where would you suggest someone start?
Whew.
Uh, so
Where-
someone who's interested in learning about like the roots of Black gospel music or Black art, like where would you suggest that they start?
Oh man. I feel like there are so many starting points, and if you talk to somebody different, they may give you certain starting points. So let me start by saying my answer is completely subjective. Out of this is there's no true roadmap. Like, this is the central
Mhm.
starting point to gospel, and it spreads from here. It's not like the genealogy of Jesus. It's definitely like it's definitely subjective to my purview.
Uh-huh.
But when you think about like the birthing of gospel music, I undoubtedly start with spirituals. Just period. That's just where my mind goes. Just the generation before the generation before the generation ever came into be. Those spirituals are what kind of really helped us along the way. I also think about call and response. Look into what call and response truly is and where call and response started. I think that'll give you a good running start. I'm not giving you artists. I'm giving you things to look up. I'm not saying start with Mahalia Jackson. I think she's great, but I think even if you want to go before that, I think the theme of things is where you kind of start. You start with spirituals. You start with hymns. And specifically what hymns meant for our people. I think you start with things like call and response. And then I think you start looking at and breaking down the origins of each genre that you listen to. Here's what I mean by that. If you like jazz, start looking into where did jazz begin? Okay, you start realizing that jazz starts in New Orleans, several decades, hundreds of years ago, whatever. We don't have to get into that now. But if you want to look at the gospel, like look at what the origin of gospel was. You'd want to look into rock and roll. Perhaps you like rock. I love rock and roll. That's one of my favorite things. You start looking at Chuck Berry and different things like that. Like where did these start?
No, that started with Black.
It started with Black folks, y'all. I'm trying to tell you everything. I'll tell you what. I'll give you an example. There's a band that I love, like I absolutely love. It's a white rock band called Foo Fighters. They're absolutely crazy. Dave was the lead singer. He's from Springfield, Virginia. They're great. But even if you listen to their music and the way their chords are structured and the way that Dave Grohl writes, and even on one of their last albums, the rhythmic nature by which they presented their music, there is Black culture all through that. You know what I'm saying? Like the rhythmic nature of it all. Like you can see, once again, going back to what we said earlier, you can see the fingerprint, the thumbprint, the handprint of Chuck Berry and of James Brown, who was also the king of soul, but also like did a lot of rock and roll in his shows, and like the sweating and the throwing of the hands and he's jumping in the like all that stuff is still replicated in rock and roll, but it started with those guys. I'm sorry.
Right?
Say it again.
I said, and a lot of things that they saw in the church, right?
And all that stuff, they start in the church. They saw in the church, like people in the Baptist. We don't have to get time. In the every church, the Baptist church, all these different things. They started seeing these expressions first in the church, and then brought them to the secular world for the world to see. So even if you look at that, I think that's so great that you mentioned that, because I think people like James Brown and people like Marvin Gaye put the church on the forefront. It might not have been the same message. Let's be clear. Not saying lead people to the Lord. But the excitable nature of it all, the excitable and the passion that was exhibited, that was undoubtedly threaded back to the church. So artists like that put that kind of expression on the forefront for the world to see. That's what I was trying to say. I'm sorry if I misspoke.
Yes, right.
But if you want to look into get more into the nitty gritty of different things, I highly suggest you start looking at the origins of the genres you're listening to. Not just artists, but not just what your favorite song is, but look at like the origins of the genres you're listening to. Because I can guarantee you, I bet you any amount of money that you're gonna find that it either started from the Black community or evolved in the Black community. So.
That's awesome. This has been absolutely incredible. I have enjoyed this conversation personally. Was it fun?
It was fun. I enjoyed it. Cool.
I feel like you have really taught and exposed us to so many things. If you guys have any questions, you can leave them in the last couple of seconds. But I want to know, we've learned a lot just about everyone's music, and we touched on some of the music that you do. If anyone's listening and they're not familiar with Zóé, or they've never heard a song that you've written, how can they find Zóé and learn more about the music that you help produce?
Yes, absolutely. So Zóé, which Pastor Lauren has mentioned, is the recording group, the worship group that is birthed out of our church in Richmond, the Life Church. You can find our live album, which we just released last Easter. It's crazy. It's almost been a year, but you can find that on all of the streaming platforms that are available. You can just type in Zóé live at the Life Church RVA, and it'll pop right on up. It was produced by myself and Justin Brown, and written by myself. Pastor Vernon has written some songs. If you didn't know, Pastor Vernon is an amazing songwriter. And it was just amazing and just honoring to be a part of this process with an amazing team. Really excited about that.
Had written some songs.
Pastor Danielle is there. I wish Pastor Danielle, funny enough, Pastor Danielle is actually leading worship right now.
Right.
youth group, which is amazing as well. But if you look on all our streaming platforms, you can find us. You can find us on Instagram at Zóé Worship. You can find us on YouTube at Zóé Worship. You'll find all of our live recording videos there. You can, yeah, those are it. I believe. I'm also very bad at marketing, so somebody.
I think you put it on the basis on all streaming platforms. Zóé.
All streaming platforms live at the Life Church RPA.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, thank you so much for having this conversation with us. I am just excited about everything again that we've been exposed to. I feel like this is a conversation that people should go back and listen to, kind of take some notes, and maybe even go on a bit of your own kind of discovery as it relates to the roots of gospel music. And maybe you'll find different ways that it's even elevated and exposed or helped shape your own faith.
Yeah.
So thank you so much again, Pastor Rivers, for sharing with us. Guys, make sure that you join us again next Thursday at 7 p.m. right here on Facebook and YouTube. We'll be talking about Black faith and theology and how it has kept and carried us through generations. Again, it's not a conversation you will want to miss. So we look forward to seeing you then, and we hope you guys have a great night.
Peace, peace.